The cabin is worth nothing to anyone else. But go ahead, waste your time on that ridiculous cabin. It'll fall apart before winter's over, Hawk mocked. But Elias was determined. Hi, dearest viewer. If you're enjoying this story, a quick like or subscribe would be such a blessing. It helps me share more heartfelt stories with you. And if you don't mind, tell me where you're watching from. I read every single comment with a smile. Now, let us get back to the story. The wind howled through Cold Valley, Montana. As Elias Greer stood at the edge of his family's cabin, the cold biting into his skin. At just 14, he was far too young to shoulder the weight of the homestead, yet there he was, looking out over the land his parents had left behind. The valley, remote, harsh, and unforgiving, had claimed both his parents to a typhoid outbreak only months ago. Now the responsibility of the land, the legacy of his family, was his to carry. Cold Valley was notorious for its brutal winters. The thermometer, if it were ever left outside long enough, could freeze in the depths of winter, and the snowstorms that swept through the valley were fierce enough to bury entire houses under drifts of powder. Most people in the valley made do with the isolation, but the cold was something far worse than just an inconvenience. For those who had lived here long enough, the winters could mean the difference between survival and death. Elias's parents had made it through, but now they were gone. He was alone, left with 80 acres of land, acres of snow, and an oppressive sense of loss that threatened to swallow him whole. The legacy of his family was there in the land, but it seemed like a cruel inheritance. The land his parents had worked so hard for had become a monument to their absence. Despite the crushing weight of grief, Elias was determined. He would live up to the family's tradition in Cold Valley. He had no choice. The land had always been his parents' life, and now it would be his. He would survive. He would thrive. But in the back of his mind, doubt gnawed at him. How could he, just a boy, keep alive the dream that had been passed down to him? He turned away from the valley and walked into the cabin, a small but sturdy structure that had served his family through many winters. The wood was worn, and the walls seemed to groan with age, but it had always been enough. That was the way of Cold Valley. People made do with what they had. He'd been taught not to expect much. But something inside him was restless, something that told him he wasn't meant to merely survive. He was meant to make something more of this place, something that would honor his parents' hard work, something that would break the endless cycle of isolation. Elias's thoughts drifted to a time when life had been less about survival and more about adventure. The summer before his parents' death, his aunt had taken him to New Hampshire. They'd visited an old covered bridge, the wooden structure ancient yet enduring, protecting travelers from the elements. It was a bridge through time, a solution to a problem as old as the seasons themselves: how to move from one place to another without braving the dangerous forces of nature. Elias had been mesmerized by it. The bridge was not only functional, but it was also a symbol of innovation. It offered a path forward without facing the torment of rain or snow or wind. He had asked his aunt why they didn't build houses like that in Cold Valley. His aunt had laughed at the idea. "Because we're not insects, boy. We need space," she had said, brushing off the question as nothing more than the naive curiosity of a child. But Elias couldn't shake the thought. What if there was a way? What if he could do something similar in Cold Valley, something that could help people here, not just survive, but live? As the weeks passed, the idea began to take shape in Elias's mind. Why couldn't the same principle be applied here? Cold Valley was a place of isolation, but it didn't have to be. If he could connect two cabins, perhaps even more, by a covered passage, it could change everything. It wouldn't just be about moving from one building to another without stepping outside into the biting cold. It would be about giving people in Cold Valley a way to live without constant exposure to the dangers of winter. The more Elias thought about it, the more certain he became. The cabins would have to be elevated, to allow the snow to pass underneath. The roof would need to shed the snow, not collect it. The walls would need to be sturdy enough to withstand the harsh winds. But if he could get it right, it would work. He was sure of it. He spent days sketching, using the limited materials he had. He measured, drew, and planned. The idea was simple enough, but it required precision, and Elias knew it'd be a challenge to build. Yet, there was something inside him, something deep that told him he had to try, but Elias knew better than to think the idea would be well received. He had learned that the valley wasn't a place that welcomed change. People here survived, yes, but they did so by sticking to what had always worked, even if it meant enduring the winters in silence and isolation. Elias was about to challenge that unspoken rule. When he shared his vision with the locals, the response was immediate and dismissive. Owen Thorpe, a neighbor who had lived in Cold Valley for decades, didn't mince words. "You've got one cabin already. Why do you need two?" Owen scoffed, his face crinkled with age and suspicion. "And why would you need to connect them like that? It's foolish." Elias met his gaze, trying to stay calm. Owen had lived here his whole life, but Elias wasn't about to back down. "It's not foolish, it's a way to survive. To make things better." But Owen just shook his head. "Better? You'll be buried under snow before you finish that monstrosity. It won't work." Elias didn't respond. He had known it wouldn't be easy, but he had not expected the ridicule to sting as much as it did. The same doubts came from the rest of the valley. Victor Hawk, the valley's wealthiest rancher, was the loudest critic. Elias had already rejected several of Hawk's offers to buy the land. Hawk had no interest in preserving the legacy of Elias's family. He wanted the land for himself, but Elias had refused. And now the rancher made sure to make his feelings known about the young boy's mad ideas. "The land's worth nothing to anyone else," Hawk had said. "But go ahead, waste your time on that ridiculous cabin. It'll fall apart before winter's over." Elias's resolve only strengthened. He wasn't foolish, he wasn't mad. This was his family's land, and he was going to do something with it. The cold might claim his parents, but it would not claim him. Elias began working on the project in secret. The mocking words of his neighbors stung, but they only fueled his determination. This was his chance to prove that Cold Valley didn't have to be a place of endless isolation and survival by brute force. He could change it. And no one, not Owen Thorpe, not Victor Hawk, could stop him. With every swing of his hammer, Elias could almost hear his parents' voices urging him to keep going. "This is your legacy, Elias. Make it count." The cold winds began to pick up again, but Elias Greer, despite all the doubt and mockery, was ready to build something that would change Cold Valley forever. The first flakes of snow had begun to fall, and the harsh winds of Cold Valley whispered their warning. The long, brutal winter was approaching, and Elias Greer had no time to waste. His hands, calloused from months of work, gripped the axe tightly as he chopped the wood. Each strike was measured, each cut deliberate. The cabin was taking shape slowly, but surely, and Elias could feel the weight of his family's legacy pressing down on him with every piece of timber he placed. Asterisk. The second cabin was meant to be a workshop, a space where he could work in the winter months without stepping outside into the biting cold. But it wasn't just about that. The real heart of the project, the elevated passageway that would connect the two cabins, was still in the early stages. Elias's mind raced as he carefully measured the lengths of the wood, adjusting his plans as he went along. The passage had to be just right. It had to be strong enough to withstand the weight of the snow, tall enough to allow him to move freely without stooping, and sturdy enough to hold up against the harsh winds of Cold Valley. The passage was to be elevated, with thick beams placed securely in the ground to support the structure. It would have an insulated roof to shed the snow and keep the inside dry, while slatted walls would allow for ventilation, ensuring that the air would not become too stale. Every decision Elias made was calculated. He worked with a purpose, knowing that this wasn't just a project, it was a solution. It was a lifeline. Each night, as the cold set in, Elias would light the small oil lamp in the corner of the cabin and sit at his makeshift desk planning the next steps. His loyal cat Bear sat by his side, curled up on the chair next to him, offering silent companionship. Bear had been with him since his parents' passing, and though the large orange cat didn't understand the intricacies of construction, he provided the quiet support Elias desperately needed. The work was exhausting. Each day blended into the next as Elias cut and measured, built and rebuilt, trying to ensure that everything was perfect. But even as the work continued, the doubt began to creep in. The valley's winters were unforgiving. The storms that ravaged the land could tear down entire barns, uproot trees, and collapse homes. What made Elias think his humble passageway would survive? He had no experience building anything of this scale. What if he was wrong? But he couldn't stop. The weight of his parents' memory pushed him forward, and the thought of failing wasn't something he could entertain. He had to make this work, not just for him, but for the whole valley. Word of Elias's project spread quickly, as news of any major event in Cold Valley did. The townspeople, initially skeptical of his ambitions, soon began to gossip. It wasn't long before Owen Thorpe came around again, his face scrunched in confusion as he watched Elias work. "You're wasting your time, boy," Owen said, shaking his head as he surveyed the construction site. "The wind'll tear it apart. And even if it does stand, what's the point? You've got one cabin, that's all you need." Elias didn't even look up from his work. "This will make it easier," he said quietly, his voice steady. "We'll survive the winter." Owen snorted, taking a step back. "You're just trying to escape grief, that's all. Your parents are gone. This land, it's too much for you, you're just a boy." Elias clenched his jaw, but he didn't respond. He had heard those words before, and they didn't hurt anymore. Not like they used to, but the doubts didn't stop with Owen. Victor Hawk, the wealthiest rancher in the valley, had offered to buy Elias's land on 3 separate occasions, and each time Elias had refused. Hawk wasn't used to hearing no, especially not from someone like Elias, a boy with no family and no wealth to speak of. His offers, each more generous than the last, grew more insistent, and Elias had refused them all. Hawk's disdain for Elias only grew. The rancher would often ride by the construction site on horseback, sneering as he passed, muttering insults under his breath. Elias could hear the words when the wind was just right. "Stubborn fool," Hawk would say. "Your land's worthless to anyone but you." Despite the ridicule, Elias's resolve only grew. He had to prove them wrong. He had to show Cold Valley that there was more to this land than mere survival. He would make something here. Something that lasted. But as the days grew colder and the work seemed to stretch on endlessly, Elias couldn't shake the gnawing feeling that he might be in over his head. The nights grew longer, and Elias found himself losing track of time. The weight of his task felt heavier with each passing day. He could hear the wind howling outside, the ice cracking and groaning as it pressed against the cabin walls. One night, as Elias sat by the fire, his thoughts turned inward. What if he was wrong? What if the passage couldn't hold up against the storms? The doubts he had buried for so long began to surface once more. He could almost hear his father's voice in his head. "You have to be strong, Elias. You have to push through. It's the only way." But was it really the only way? His hand tightened around the wood of the chair as he stared into the flames. He had started this because he believed it was the right thing to do. He believed it could make Cold Valley a better place, a safer place. But now he wasn't sure. What if the winters won? What if Cold Valley defeated him as it had defeated so many others? Bear, who had been quietly napping on the floor, stretched and padded over to Elias, rubbing his head against the boy's leg. Elias absent-mindedly stroked the cat's back, grateful for the silent companionship. There was something about Bear's quiet presence that grounded him. Something about the way the cat seemed to understand that Elias needed his space, his time to think. Elias leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes. The storm outside raged, but inside, he found a moment of peace. His parents had fought the cold, survived it, and now it was his turn. Elias Greer was not going to let the cold take him. He wasn't going to let Cold Valley take him. The road ahead was uncertain, and the work was only beginning, but Elias knew one thing for sure. He had started something, and no matter what happened next, he wasn't going to stop. Not now. As the wind howled louder, Elias stood up, his decision made. The doubt might come again, but for now he would continue. He would finish what he had started. And Cold Valley would know someday that he had been here. And maybe, just maybe, they would see what he had built and understand. The first sign of trouble came in early December, when the winds began to pick up. Elias had been expecting it. The winters in Cold Valley had a rhythm of their own. But nothing could have prepared him for the storm that was about to descend upon them. Before the blizzard hit, Grayson Bennett had arrived in Cold Valley, looking like he had stepped out of the pages of a magazine. Dressed in fine furs and riding a sleek black stallion, Grayson looked completely out of place in a town where the houses were little more than sturdy shelters against the harsh weather. Cold Valley had no use for wealth, not in the traditional sense. But Grayson wasn't like the locals. He wasn't here to live in the valley. He was here to make it work for him. Grayson had heard the rumors about Elias Greer and his strange double cabin design. A boy, they said, who had been abandoned by his parents and now lived alone, building something that sounded as foolish as it was impractical. But Grayson, ever the opportunist, knew that sometimes the most unconventional ideas were the ones that led to success. The first time Grayson laid eyes on Elias's project, he was impressed. At first, he had assumed it was a childish fantasy, an attempt by a lonely boy to create something he could control in a world that had taken everything from him. But there was something about the structure, something that caught his sharp businessman's eye. The two cabins, separated by a long passageway, stood firm against the elements, designed to withstand everything Cold Valley had to offer. Elevated passage, which Elias had worked tirelessly on, was nothing short of ingenious. It was more than a structure, it was a solution to the very problem that had plagued the valley for generations. Grayson stood at a distance, watching Elias carefully. The boy moved with purpose, his eyes scanning the work with a focused intensity. It was clear that Elias wasn't just trying to survive. He was trying to change the way things were done. And Grayson respected that. He approached Elias, the crunch of his boots in the snow loud against the silence of the valley. "You've done something remarkable here, boy," Grayson said, his voice smooth and authoritative. "I've been watching you. I think I can help you." Elias turned to face him, his expression unreadable. Grayson was used to people being impressed by him, used to being the one in control. But there was something about Elias that made him pause. The boy wasn't intimidated by his wealth or status. If anything, there was a quiet resolve in his eyes, as though he already knew who he was. Grayson continued, "I'd like to buy the land. You see, I've been eyeing Cold Valley for some time now. There's a lot of potential here, and I think we could make something of it. A partnership, perhaps. You'll have financial security, access to resources, everything you could need to expand this design of yours. You could make a fortune." Elias hesitated, his eyes narrowing slightly as he considered the offer. He had heard it before, men like Grayson, men with money and power, coming to offer him a way out, a way to make his life easier. But he had already made his decision. The land wasn't just dirt and timber, it was his parents' legacy. It was all he had left of them. He wouldn't sell it. "Not for money, not for anything. I'm not selling," Elias said quietly, his voice steady. "This land is my family's, and I have no interest in partnering with you." Grayson's smile faltered for just a moment, surprise flickering in his eyes. But then he recovered, his expression unreadable. "I see. Well, I'm not going anywhere. I'll be around if you change your mind." As Grayson turned to leave, Elias felt a wave of relief wash over him. He had made the right choice, but something about Grayson's presence made Elias uneasy. The billionaire's confidence was hard to ignore. He was used to getting what he wanted. Little did Elias know, this was just the beginning of something much bigger. The storm hit later that week. It started as a whisper, a quiet threat carried on the wind, but by the time night fell, it was a raging monster. Snow whipped through the valley, the winds howling like wolves in a frenzy. Elias had seen storms before, but this one was unlike any he had encountered. The cabin walls groaned under the pressure, and the howling wind seemed to shake the very ground beneath his feet. But inside, Elias was calm. He had built the double cabin and the passageway to survive exactly this kind of storm. He had designed it to withstand the harshest weather Cold Valley could throw at him. The passage was elevated, with thick beams sunk deep into the ground, and the roof was angled just right to shed the snow and prevent any accumulation. As the blizzard raged outside, Elias moved freely between the two cabins, unimpeded by the weather. He paused, standing in the middle of the passageway, watching the storm swirl outside through the small windows. It was a feeling of triumph, of validation. His work was holding up. The wind howled, but the passage stood strong. It was working perfectly. Elias didn't know how long the storm would last, but he knew one thing for sure. He had built something that would save lives. He had built something that would change Cold Valley. As the storm dragged on, the rest of the valley wasn't so fortunate. Families were trapped inside their homes, their roofs collapsing under the weight of the snow. Elias's neighbors, the ones who had mocked him, were now feeling the effects of the storm. But Elias was ready. He knew what needed to be done. Evelyn Thorpe, Owen's daughter, arrived at his cabin with her family in tow, desperate for shelter. Their home had collapsed and they had nowhere else to go. Elias didn't hesitate. He led them through the passageway to the workshop, where the fire was still burning bright. The warmth was a welcome relief from the freezing cold outside. "Stay here," Elias said, his voice quiet but firm. "You'll be safe." The storm raged outside, but inside, the passage provided warmth and protection. It was everything Elias had hoped for, everything he had worked so hard to create. Grayson Bennett, watching from a distance, could hardly believe what he was seeing. The blizzard, which had buried the valley, was relentless, but Elias's passage was standing strong. It was more than just a structure, it was a lifeline. Grayson, who had come here thinking the boy was nothing more than a dreamer, began to see things differently. This wasn't just an idea, it was a solution to a real problem, something that could change how people lived in Cold Valley and beyond. It took only a moment for Grayson to make up his mind. He approached Elias again, this time with a different offer. A partnership. The boy's vision, coupled with Grayson's resources, could make this design something more than just a shelter. It could be a movement. A way to change the way people lived, not just in Cold Valley, but across the country. "I see what you've done here," Grayson said, his voice more earnest than before. "You were right. I can't offer you money or land. But I can offer you something else, an opportunity to spread this design. Let's work together." Elias stood in silence for a moment, weighing the offer. It wasn't about money. It wasn't about success. It was about survival. And this partnership, this opportunity, could change everything. "I'll think about it," Elias said, his voice steady. But inside, he knew this was the beginning of something much bigger than he could have imagined. The blizzard of December had left Cold Valley in ruins. The valley that had already been a difficult place to survive was now a testament to nature's wrath, as homes and barns collapsed under the weight of the snow. Yet, as the storm cleared and the sky began to clear, there was one place that stood strong: Elias Greer's double cabin and the passageway that connected them. Elias stood at the edge of his land, watching the devastation around him. Snow still clung to the rooftops, and the air was thick with the remnants of the storm. But his cabin, his work, had withstood it all. The passage, elevated and insulated, remained intact. Owen Thorpe, the neighbor who had once mocked Elias's design, now stood beside him. The older man's face was solemn, his usual skepticism replaced by respect. "I was wrong," Owen said, his voice low, almost apologetic. "That passage, it saved us all." The sincerity in Owen's words hit Elias harder than he expected. Owen had been the first to dismiss his project, the first to claim it was nothing more than a wild dream. But now, standing in the ruins of the valley, he could see it. He could see how the passage had kept families safe, how it had protected them from the storm's fury. Even Victor Hawk, the wealthiest man in Cold Valley, stood not far behind. Hawk, usually so confident and self-assured, was uncharacteristically silent. His face, usually so smug, was now tinged with frustration and grudging admiration. "I didn't believe you," Hawk admitted, his pride evident in his voice. "But you were right. This passage of yours, it works." Elias stood still, his gaze fixed on the passageway. It had worked. It had saved lives. The ridicule he had faced, the doubts, the mockery, they all seemed so distant now, swallowed by the storm that had shown the world what his design could truly do. "Everyone doubted you, boy," Owen said, his voice heavy. "I'm sorry I ever questioned you." Elias nodded but said nothing. Words were no longer necessary. His design had spoken for itself. Cold Valley, a place of isolation, had now become a community, a place where people could come together, not just to survive, but to thrive. As the days following the storm turned into weeks, the changes in Cold Valley were evident. People who had once mocked Elias's vision were now discussing how they could implement similar designs in their own homes. Evelyn Thorpe, Owen's daughter, helped Elias work on the passageway, bringing supplies from her family's farm, now under the protection of the Greer's passage. It wasn't just the neighbors who had taken notice. Word of the design spread throughout the region. Grayson Bennett, the billionaire who had once tried to buy Elias's land, had returned to Cold Valley, observing the aftermath of the storm. He had seen the potential in Elias's design, and now, he saw the undeniable truth. It worked. Grayson sought Elias out, and they met again, this time on much different terms. "Elias," Grayson said, his voice steady, "you've proven that your design works. I've seen the people, the way they've come together. What you've done here is not just about building, it's about survival. I'm not here to buy your land anymore. I'm here to offer you something else." Elias raised an eyebrow, unsure of what Grayson was getting at. "I want to partner with you," Grayson continued. "I'll fund your designs. I'll help you spread this system across the region. The Greer Passage could change more than just Cold Valley. It could change the way people live in the coldest parts of the world. You won't have to do it alone. You'll have the resources to make it happen." Elias was taken aback. The offer wasn't what he had expected. He had refused to sell his land, but this was different. Grayson wasn't offering to take his family's legacy. He was offering to help expand it, to share it with others. For a moment, Elias hesitated. The idea of working with a billionaire, a man who had so much power, was daunting. But then he remembered the storm. The people who had found refuge in his cabin, the lives saved. His parents. Legacy had never been about land or money. It had always been about survival, about community. Grayson's offer wasn't about money. It was about opportunity. Elias made his decision. "I'll do it," he said quietly. "But on my terms, my designs, my legacy." Grayson nodded, a slight smile crossing his face. "Agreed. You'll remain in control, Elias. But together, we can build something bigger than just this valley." As the years passed, Elias's design spread across Montana, Wyoming, and even parts of Canada and Alaska. The Greer Passage, as it came to be known, became a standard in harsh climates. Families who had once been isolated by snow and ice were now connected, able to move freely between homes, workshops, and barns without fear of the cold. Elias traveled from town to town, teaching others how to build the passageway, sharing his knowledge with anyone willing to learn. Cold Valley, once a place of solitude, now became a hub for innovation. With Elias at the center of it all, people came from far and wide to see the original double cabin and passageway. They marveled at the design, at the ingenuity that had saved lives and changed the way people thought about survival. Elias's name became known far beyond the valley, and his reputation as an innovator grew in the years that followed. Elias married Evelyn Thorpe, the girl who had believed in him when no one else did. Together they had children, and Elias continued to teach them the importance of innovation, of creating solutions to the problems that nature presented. When Elias passed away in 1954, Cold Valley mourned the loss of a visionary. The people he had helped, the families whose lives he had saved, gathered to honor him. His double cabin and passageway still stood as a monument to his ingenuity and determination, and his legacy lived on through the many passage systems that had saved lives across the region. If you enjoyed this incredible story of resilience, innovation, and community, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring content. Don't forget to share this video with your friends. Let's spread Elias Greer's legacy of perseverance and ingenuity far and wide. Now we want to hear from you. Do you think Elias made the right choice in refusing Grayson Bennett's offer? Or should he have taken the opportunity to expand his invention even further? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your opinions and spark a discussion.